My feeling is, as a person who has worked many years in the history of the Jews, that the history of the Jews is interesting, but it is not so important. There are so many people in the world, so many nations. One nation, it's not that important. So why is it possible to spend time studying the story of one nation or one group in one time in one place? Well, my feeling is that it is useful to study such a history if it can help understand a little more about humans and people in general. And I think the Jewish history is only important if it can be an illustration to general problems or general issues that different nations or different groups have. Now, for me, the case of migration is very, very simple and applicable, because the issue of migration is one that affects every population. And there are, as I will try to convince you, patterns of migration. And like other groups, Jews migrated perhaps more than other populations, but migration is a migration. And studying the history of the migration of Jews can be useful, I think, to think about the migration of other groups. So, if you forget everything that I say, but when you consider one group or another group, why they moved or why they migrated, then I'm happy. That's what's important, is to think and in an analytical way, not my father did or some person did, but how do people behave? And this is a question which links history with social sciences. I'll just ask, of the people here, how many of you were born in Kiev? There are many, many hands which are not up. That means one of two things. Either you don't understand me, or it means that migration, moving from place to place, is something which is an issue today, just as in the past. Sometimes people move for a few years. Sometimes people think they are moving for a few years, and then they never go back home. I came to Israel for 1 year, and I never went back to the United States. I was a migrant by surprise. But the issue of migration is a almost universal human situation. People who do not migrate often have to make a decision not to migrate. And that is also a decision. So I asked you to look at an article by Grigg on what he saw as the laws of migration, basing himself on migration in England. And what I want to do is to go over these laws and to explain them, because the article is very short, and to discuss the relevance of these laws to Jewish history. And then I want to go look at the question of how did the Jews come to Eastern Europe? What were the roots? And but more important, what were the reasons? My hope is to complete that today, but if I do not, then I will keep complete that hopefully tomorrow, and I'll try to adjust to the time available. Now, the question of migration, as Greg put it, is very much a question of behavior. But I think that one can add that the key element in migration is information. A person needs knowledge about opportunities in another place in order to migrate. I mean, otherwise, it is a very silly thing to do, because migration is always complex. A person lives in a familiar place, if it's a young person in a home, and to go to a new place means to find a place to live. It means to find a place to earn money to survive. If we're talking about students, it's an opportunity to study or, as I mentioned, to work. All of this requires information. So if I would offer a person here a ticket by air to one city or another city in South America, I think that most people would think twice before going, unless they know, is this a nice area for hiking? Is it a nice place to visit? Is it a place where one can work, if we're talking about a longer term? But to go to a place where you do not know anything about it is dangerous. What if you go there and there's nothing to do? It is a very long way to go home. So therefore, Greg points out that the most people who migrate go short distances. He was talking about England. If we talk about short distances, what is the reality behind the short distances? Where are these people going from, and where are they going to? If it's the 19th century, where are they going to? Without naming names, to cities. Most migration in the 19th century is to cities. There are periods when migration is in the other direction, but those are rare in the modern period. The people go from the city to a farm. What is very more common, especially in the United States, but not only, that people who live in cities that are crowded and noisy, where do they move? Not to the farm, but suburbs. A nearby region to a city where one can purchase a bigger house with some land. It's quiet, it's clean, and then every day you can get in a car and then have traffic jams and spend 2 hours to go to the city and 2 hours to go back. After several years, maybe some people go back to live in the city. But most migration in the modern period has been from 2 cities, and then if it's short distance migration, where are people coming from? Either farms or villages in the vicinity of the city. So that's from farms or villages. Now, this then implies a number of shifts. First of all, it's the location is changing. Somebody's going to a city. What else changes? what changes as well is the occupation. Now, if you memorized the laws of Grieg, I would say, now consider law number 6. If you did not memorize the laws of Grieg, I will tell you what law 6 is. Law 6 is that females migrate more short distances, males migrate more long distances. Now, if we say that females migrate more, but in short distances, more than men, what kind of a reality is behind that in the modern period? Not today, but 100 years ago. Here we're talking about almost scientific laws. I want to think about the human reality. What is meant by women migrate short distances? What are they doing? There are many women who migrate short distances, more than men. What do the women do when they go to the city in 1750 or even 1800? The most common thing for a village woman to do when she goes to a city is to find work as a household helper, as a servant in a rich urban family. What are the other options? There aren't very many other options. The woman does not bring industrial skills. She doesn't bring an education that would allow her to work in an office to the degree that we're offices. Untrained women from villages can often find jobs in a home, working in the household. This is very, very common. Why are there more women than men who make this kind of a move? Because when we talk about getting a job in the home, which sex gets preference? Women. Because the husband, if he wants to leave his wife alone at home with a helper, what does he prefer? Another woman, and not a handsome young man who would be a potential distraction. So that we have significant migration from village to city of women, and they find work in homes. Now, if we consider the question of information, how do they know about opportunities in the city? And the answer is, it is not so difficult. They live nearby, they go to the city for markets, they go to the city to purchase certain things. Therefore, they can hear about opportunities, so they will know about opportunities in a nearby city. They will know much less about opportunities far away in a city here. And they know that there is always competition in a faraway city from other women who live in the area around them. So the advantages are to seek employment in an area which is nearby. Now, we will take a short break, not with the kind you want, another kind of break, and discuss a little bit about Jewish culture, because here it is significant. Now, what about the migration of Jewish women from small towns or villages to urban centers? Did this migration operate in the same way? And the answer is, in my opinion, everything I say is my opinion. That doesn't mean it's right, but that's what I think. That migration of Jewish women was much more limited than migration of non-Jewish women. Now, why do I say this? Here, Jewish culture comes into play. Let us say that a Jewish woman comes from a village to a city and seeks employment as a servant. She wants to make a little bit of money. She doesn't want to spend her whole life working in a family, but she wants to spend a few years and save some money. She may end up her whole life there, that happens, but people don't usually realize that when they're 17 years old. Where will she find work? There are two possibilities, Plan A or Plan B. Most of the people in a city are not Jewish. Can she find work in a non-Jewish family? The answer is, it's a big problem. Why? If she, what?
It depends on family, yes or no?
It depends on the family, but if she comes from a Jewish family, we're talking about Jewish women, what kind of food does she eat?
Kosher.
She eats kosher food. She cannot go to a non-Jewish family and say, well, now you have to all eat kosher. That's not going to work. And just as complicated, she keeps the Jewish holidays, and Jewish holidays are a problem because they come all the time. Every week is the Sabbath, is Shabbat, and she can't work and she can't clean. So it's very difficult to find, for a Jewish girl, to find work in a non-Jewish family. So that leaves Plan B. What is Plan B?
Find
Not a Jewish family. Maybe she can find work in a Jewish family, and there's no problem with kosher, and there's no problem with the Sabbath. Kosher is not much of a problem for the Jewish family. But if a Jewish family is looking for a woman to work in their house, who will the Jewish family prefer? This is not so simple. If they take a Jewish girl, then she already knows about the laws of kosher food. She knows about the laws of the Sabbath. It's very simple. But what happens if they take a non-Jewish woman to work in their family?
She can work in Shabbat.
She can do things on the Sabbath that are not permitted for a Jew. Let's say that a light goes out. She can turn on the light again. She can fix things. It's very, very convenient. There, many years ago, years ago, I went to visit in Belarus, and I went to a small village, and I met an old woman who spoke Yiddish. I thought, this is very interesting. So I asked the woman to tell me how many other Jews live in the village. And she said, what do you mean, other Jews? I'm not Jewish. So I said, then how do you know Yiddish? So she said, of course. I worked several years in a house of Jews, and I learned how to speak Yiddish. And this was not a rare phenomenon. That one had servants who worked in the household. They knew everything that was going on in the household. They saw everything. And they learned Yiddish. They knew the holidays. They knew what had to be done. And If the children did not say their prayers, they would tell them, you have to say your prayers, this is not right. They were part of the family, but also not part of the family. And this phenomenon was very widespread. And it explains a question which I am not certain many people have asked. And this is a question which for a long time bothered me. Never understood it. There is a belief among many people that Jews use the blood of Christians in the matzah on Pesach. It's not true.
Really?
But what I did not understand is not how people believe it. People believe many strange things. And for Jews, Christians were strange. For Christians, Jews were strange. Everybody thought that other people were strange. That I also understand. Now, if somebody tells you a story that somebody else does something secretly, how can you know if it is true or not true? If somebody would tell me that Christians do something in a church on a Christian holiday, I don't know what they do. I don't go to church. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. How can I tell? What I would do, very simply, is ask a friend of mine who is a Christian, a good friend I trust, and I would say, tell me, is this done in a church? And the friend would say to me, of course not. And then I would ask, can I trust my friend? Or maybe he doesn't want to tell me the truth. Living in Ukraine, you all know about false news. This is a big problem. How do you distinguish something from the truth or not the truth? You read it in a newspaper. How do you know if what is in the newspaper is true, or did somebody pay for the newspaper to print this story? So I was thinking on the reverse. For a Christian, how could they know whether Jews didn't use blood for matzah? The more a Jew would say, of course we don't use it, the more the listener would say, yeah, he says that, but you know, Jews don't eat pork, which is strange. They don't work on Saturday, which is strange. Maybe they do other strange things. And I think what is interesting is not that some people believed this story, but what is most interesting is that most people did not. If you consider the history here in Ukraine, there were very few cases where people believed the story. It's odd. Why didn't they believe it? Part of the answer is, who really knew? All of the non-Jewish women who worked in Jewish homes. They knew everything that happened in the home. They even knew when the husband and wife were arguing. They knew where they hid their money. They were part of the family. And if you would ask them, did Jews use blood? They would say, of course not. I'm there every day. How could they do it if I didn't see it? This is a source which is reliable, so that we have short distance migration of women, which is mainly for household help, and in this case it is more common among non-Jewish women than Jewish, because Jewish families preferred non-Jewish helpers in the house, and this had all kinds of results far beyond the simple results of migration. That is the first point that Grieg wants to raise. The second point is one which is more difficult. His claim was that you have step-to-step migration. This is migration from the farm to a small town, and then perhaps the same person or their children going from small town to a city. This, in the case of the Jewish population, is much more, or was much more complex. Why was it more complex? I will ask you, which move is more difficult? To move from a farm to a small town, or to move from a small town to a city? Well, I will give you the correct answer, what I think. I think that the first is more difficult. Because living on a farm, there is economic dynamic that a farmer grows or can grow most of the food that he will eat. He works by an agricultural year. For example, if you work in a bank, summer, winter, it's the same. You work from 9 o'clock till 7 o'clock, whatever time. The daily schedule in the city or the town is the same year round. For our farmer, life changes with the seasons. The activities are related to land. The very act of going away from agriculture to an urban occupation is a very big change. Once one lives in a small town but works for money and works on a daily schedule, then going from a small town to a city is a less dramatic change. For the Jewish population, this shift was different. Why? Jews generally, not always, but generally in Eastern Europe were involved in every occupation except agriculture, for a variety of reasons. One reason is, and this is the most important reason, Jews were not allowed to purchase land. This was a restriction. It was just for Christians who were full citizens, and the Jews didn't complain. This was part of the reality. So Jews generally could not buy land. Generally, they did not want to be farmers because this also created major difficulties in terms of the tradition, in terms of the Sabbath, even in terms of some other laws. So that wherever Jews lived, they supported themselves by what activity? Either trade and commerce, or by crafts, making things, fixing things, providing things, and there was room in between, providing services, running an inn, running some kind of a tax framework, but Jews generally were not farmers. The result was that for Jews, going from a village to a city or to a town meant doing more or less the same thing. It was not the trauma or the shift of going from agriculture to a non-agricultural activity. Therefore, for Jews, the potential for migration was dependent mainly on information and opportunities, and not so much for the shift in occupation. And I will come back to this a bit later, but I will say one thing from the very beginning, because this will come up again and again. This has to do with family structure. Most of you are young, or all of you are young. There's a phrase in Hebrew, a very useful phrase. The being young is a disease that you get over with years. You overcome being young. But what can I say? You are young. Now, when one begins to have a family, it is very interesting to consider expectations. What do parents hope for their children? So, if we take a look at a farmer who has a number of young children, we ask him, what do you hope for and what do you expect that your children will do 20 years from now? The hope for the future would be, I'll get older, my children will grow up, and where will they be? They will be near me, they will take over the land, they will continue what I am doing, and this is a very natural expectation, that the family ties will be maintained. And this has many implications. We'll see this maybe on Thursday. Many implications. If you take a Jew, the dynamic by necessity was very different. Let us take a Jewish tailor in a small town. Tailor is useful because many Jews were tailors, but you can say the same for shoemakers, or you can say the same for a wagon driver, almost any occupation. Like his neighbor, when he had young children, he also had expectations, and the expectations were similar to farmers in that he assumed that his children would probably do more or less what he does, but with one major difference. If a person is a tailor and he expects his child to grow and to become a tailor, let's say the tailor, the father is 25 years old, all right, he expects his child to grow up and to become a tailor. Does he want his son to work with him in his tailor shop? The answer is no. Because if the son comes into the tailor shop, that means that you need to increase the income of the shop, but there is no increase in clients. It's difficult to find more customers. If a person is a tailor, what will he say that his son will have to do? When the son grows up and becomes a tailor, what will he have to do? He will have to look for a place where they need a tailor. He expects that his son will move somewhere else. And this is a major difference in expectations. Does one expect that children will be near at home? Or does one expect that children will be far away? So, those of you who raised your hands and you said that you are from Kiev, so I don't know your families, and don't tell me, I don't want to know, but your parents can hope that you will be, in the long term, find a place to live in Kiev, and you will be nearby. For those of you who come from other cities, and that's a majority, for your parents it's already not so simple. will they come back, they say, or will they not come back? And good luck. It is not so easy. I moved far away, and every time my parents wanted to see their grandchildren, they had to fly on a plane for 15 hours. They were not always happy. It's not so simple. But this is a trade-off. If I want to live in a place which is far away, there is a price to pay. However, expectations are important. My parents did not expect me to stay in the same city. It was a boring city, and they knew I would run away as soon as I could. And I told them, the minute I finish secondary school, I'm running away, and I did. But if you expect children to stay nearby and then you have to adjust because they are moving, that is a complication. Jewish families had low expectations that their children or the next generation would be nearby. When one has low expectations, that means, is it easy for children to move or difficult? If the parents do not expect children to stay, it's easy. Children can go away without an argument. If parents expect children to stay, it's more difficult. And in families which are tied to the land, agricultural families, very often it's more difficult to accept the fact that children are moving. Now, the next law that Grieg has is that people who move far away usually go to big cities and not to small towns. This today is very clearly correct. If somebody is going from, say, Israel, where I live, to America, where will they usually go? They will start off with New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Why will they start off with a big city? Very, very simple.
More opportunities for them.
The answer is, sometimes there are more opportunities, sometimes there are fewer. Why? Because a big city, there's more competition. And very often, if you go to a smaller town, there are more opportunities because they need various specialists. The problem is that if you live far away, what is the key factor? Information. We hear stories about big cities. We know more or less what are the opportunities in a big city and what are the lack of opportunities. When we are thinking about a small town, what is the problem? We just do not have information far away. So I can be here in Kiev or in Tel Jerusalem, I can know about New York and Chicago, but talk about a place, Bend, Oregon, which is a beautiful small town in Oregon. That's where I grew up, not far from there, in the West. A wonderful town. But if you do not live in Oregon, you will not know anything about this small town. So that this information is the key problem. How can you find out what are job opportunities? If you have a friend who goes to New York and works as an electrician, he can send you information about jobs for electricians. And it could be that in New York they need more electricians. If he goes to a small town and succeeds, even if he tells you they probably do not need more electricians, He is the electrician, and there is not a need for many more. So what happens? Very often you have migration to a big city, and then this is followed by a second migration to a smaller town. Why? When one is already in the region, then one can hear about more opportunities nearby that were not known before migration. So that somebody can go from Tel Aviv to New York, and then after 2 years in New York, hear about a job in a smaller town in the region. Albany, Ithaca, no end of small towns. So that migration is always a question of information, and we know about big cities. The same thing with vacations. We go on vacation to a place with a beautiful beach, but we all know about the famous beaches. It's the ones that nobody knows about which are the best. But how do we know about it? You have to ask somebody who was there. So that distance migration is largely to big cities, and this is certainly the case with Jewish migration. They went to large cities. It doesn't matter if it's to New York today, or if 500 years ago it was to Krakow and Tel Aviv. The same thing. Migrants go to places that they know about. Grieg has another law which is more problematic. He claims that residents of large cities migrate less than residents of small towns. This it's not so clear, although it might be that the dynamic of larger cities offers more opportunities, so people don't migrate as much. People from small towns have fewer opportunities, and perhaps they want to migrate. However, there is perhaps an additional reason which Grieg did not think about. Now, there's a phrase which appears in the Talmud, which appears in other literatures as well. And the phrase is that a midget, a very small person, who stands on the shoulders of a giant can see farther away. That is true. A person who is very little but standing on the shoulders of somebody big sees more. Grieg was a great scientist, a great student of migration. I am not so great, but I can stand on his shoulders and I can add one interesting little point. If we take a look at health and disease before today the world is different, but until 100 years ago, where was it healthier? In what? Where was it more healthy? In cities or in towns?
In town?
Towns was better. What is the big problem with health in the city? There are two problems, or three problems. The biggest problem is water, because the water in cities was very often polluted by sewage. And therefore, people who drank the water in the cities often got sick. And when you have diseases which are infectious, if somebody is in a city and gets sick, it very quickly goes around. Epidemics affect cities more than they affect small towns. So that generally, urban populations died more than in non-urban populations, rural populations. And therefore, cities survived because there was constant migration to the city. If cities were dangerous for health, why did people migrate to cities? Answer, it is more fun to live in a city. You may die sooner, but until you die, you will enjoy life. And if you do not drink, and you do not eat anything with oil, and if you go to sleep every night at 9 o'clock and you don't go out at night, you will be healthy, but your life will be boring. People move to cities, and they always hoped somebody else will get sick. I will live a long life. Sometimes they were right. So that if we take a look at the fact that cities drew population, then we can look at another side of the coin, a coin that will be very important for us. Everybody learned how, not everybody, I will not embarrass anybody, but I think that most people here know how to ride a bicycle. If you remember how you learned to ride a bicycle, you learned that balance is very difficult. Balance is a problem in many areas. One area is demography. And the question is, how many children should somebody have? And the first answer is, how many children should they have? Who decides? And what are the reasons for deciding? And there are different reasons. One can take many different positions. But on the whole, the biology of humans is built for a balance, just like with other creatures. Fish lay many eggs. Why? Because very few fish survive to maturity. Most eggs do not lead to maturity. Other creatures, each one with its own birth rate. Elephants have a very low death rate, and therefore mother elephants are pregnant for, I think, 2 years. I'm not certain. That's what I was told. I did not check this. Now, with humans, generally people have more children than are necessary to reproduce the same population. But why? Because in pre-modern societies, many children died. And that more or less, considering all the children that died, that the next generation would balance out. Populations generally grew, and then there was an epidemic, or then there was a war, and then all of a sudden, whoop, half the population disappears, and then it takes a few generations to recover, and then something else happens. But the dynamic of population is not exciting. One does not see it, but it's very, very important. In cities, then, where the death rate was high, the natural growth of population was negative. The number of children who survived was less than the number of parents. So for a city to stay the same size, it always needed migration to come in. If a city needed migration to come in, that meant that the children who were born in cities could usually find a job, an occupation in the city. They did not have to look somewhere else. So therefore, in a place where the population was shrinking, there is less migration to another place. there's not so much competition. Stay where you are. In towns and in villages where the health was a bit better, the population was growing. And one has a basic limit, and it's a built-in problem in a fat community of farmers. Let us say you have a farmer and his wife and children, and the farmer has a piece of land that he works. It's very, very difficult for the farmer to plan effectively for the future. Let us say that he has 2 sons who grow up to maturity. If he divides his land in half and gives each son half, what is the problem? Usually half of the land is not enough. The farmer himself was able to live and feed his family with his land. He could not feed 2 families with his land. And if he could divide his land, his children certainly would not be able to divide it one more time. Land is a problem because it is fixed. You cannot create land. You can buy land, but you cannot create it. So that if the population is growing in a village society, there's always pressure on some of the people in that society who cannot get land to migrate and move somewhere else. One option is to move to a place where there is land and settle there on land which is not cultivated, which is not used. It could be land that is nearby, and if it is not used, there's probably a good reason. Probably the land is not so good. Or it can be further away, where you hear there is land, or one can move to a city and seek occupation there. It all depends on the situation. So that what Griggs says about city dwellers migrating less than village dwellers, this can very well be the case if we consider the demography. Is the population growing or is the population shrinking? Now, about migration of women, we discussed it. The next point that Grigg makes is very obvious and generally true, and on Thursday I will discuss when it is not true. Grigg makes a point in his law number 7 that the migration is usually a certain age group. What is the age group? Who do not migrate? Children do not. Why? They are too young, generally, to survive on their own. They cannot earn their living, and they cannot work. They're not strong enough. They don't know enough to survive. Children usually do not migrate unless with their parents. But migration of children is very, very rare. Now, who else do not migrate? Old people generally do not migrate. Sometimes they do today to be near their children who live somewhere else, or if they're rich, they can go to a warmer climate, but generally older people cannot migrate because it requires many adjustments, and it requires also very often income. So that if, for example, I would offer somebody in, I don't know, I'll try it, in Israel, a place to live and a very nice home for old people in Switzerland, they would say, it's very nice, but I don't speak German, I don't understand the language, I don't understand the culture. The house can be very nice, but what will I do there? And I will be far away from my old friends. To be by yourself in a very nice place is not usually very enjoyable. We like to be with friends. Now, migration is usually not older people, it's not children, it's also generally not families. Why? It's complicated. I want to migrate to one place, my wife wants to go to somewhere else. My children don't want to go anywhere. Migration with a family is very complicated. If it is absolutely necessary, or if there are many exceptional conditions, then it happens. But if people who are interested in society, it's not the exceptions that are interesting, it's the usual cases. So who are the people who really migrate? Young people who are over 18, often with an education and with a skill, and they are not married, or if they're married, they don't have children. So if anybody here has been thinking of trying to see what life is like in London or in Paris, I cannot tell you how it is. I don't know. But I can tell you one thing. It's much simpler without children. That for sure. So that one has a very specific window in which you can look for migration. And then people who do migrate, if it works, they stay. If it doesn't work, they can come back. If they stay, they can either look for their old boyfriend or girlfriend and tell them to join me, or they can find a local person with whom they want to build their life, if they want to at all. But migration is usually in a very small window of about 18 to 30, depending on patterns of education and patterns of marriage. So that this point is one which is very clear. Law number 8, which Greg brings, is what I discussed about the towns growing by migration and not by natural increase. We know, and this is his law number 9, that the more there is industry in cities, and the more there is big commerce in cities, the more there is going to be migration, and this migration will come from agricultural areas. And his last rule, which is my first rule for part 2 of my lecture, is the main reason for migration is economic. Now, this is useful for Jewish history. Why? Because the claim of Zionists about migrating to Israel, the first Zionists, people like Herzl and everybody else, what was their claim? That one should go to Israel for what reason? Ideology. Ideology is the reason to go to Israel. Was Grigg correct? Yes. Grigg says most migration was economic. If we would ask Grigg, Herzl says migrate for ideology. And we would say to Grigg, Grigg, will Herzl succeed or not? What would Grigg say? If migration is not economic, it will probably fail. And indeed, what happened? The first migration in the time of Herzl was very limited in numbers. If you look at the history of Zionist leaders, ask where did their children live, not so many actually lived in the land of Israel or Palestine, whatever one calls it, because successful migration is economic. Afterwards, the population did grow, and people said they came for ideology. But really, what was playing a major role? Economy. So that one of the virtues of having a yarmulke, skull cap, and a beard is we can still talk about Marx. I can talk about Marx because nobody suspects that I would be a Marxist, but economy is very important. That's Greg's last rule. Now, I want to begin to consider with you, how did the Jews come from to Eastern Europe? That would be the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including, this was the way things were, which includes the Ukraine at the time in the 16th century and onwards. How did the Jews come? So I will give you three possibilities. The first two are wrong, and the third is correct. Why? Because that's what I think. Now, the first possibility is that the Jews came to Eastern Europe because they were descended from the Khazars, who converted to Judaism, and this was already more or less in Eastern Europe, very, very eastern, by the Caspian Sea, and after they lost in a power struggle with their neighbors, they moved to the west. And this is why there's so many Jews in Eastern Europe, because there were so many Khazars. This is wrong, in my opinion. Very simply, I don't think the Khazars ever converted to Judaism. I think it's a myth. I could go into it. I'm going to be talking about it on Thursday night, I think. But I think that the evidence for it is very, very weak, and I don't think you have to believe every story you read in the books. There are a lot of stories, all kinds of myths, but there's no real evidence for it. There's no archaeological evidence for it. The Jewish sources generally don't talk about it at all, and the Jewish sources that do talk about it, I think, are forged. And just because something is written in Hebrew doesn't mean that it's true. You can forge something in Hebrew just as you can forge something in any other language. So I think there's no evidence at all for the Khazars to convert to Judaism. They were a very warlike nation that were fighting with all of their neighbors, and I really do not think that their dream was to go to synagogue 2 times a day, to pray and to put on a talis and to eat kosher food. I mean, it doesn't make sense, and there's no evidence. So even if it made sense, there's no evidence, but it doesn't even make sense. So I think that argument can be dismissed. And lastly, it's a long way from the Caspian Sea to Poland, so even that does not make sense. So we can drop that. Now, there is another possibility, and that is that the Jews came to Poland from what is now Germany, and they fled because of the persecutions of the Jews. There were definitely persecutions of the Jews, very violent persecutions of the Jews, but we now know enough to ask the first basic question: what do we have to ask if we think that the Jews who came to Eastern Europe came from Germany? What is the very basic question you have to ask to consider, does this make sense or does it not make sense? Economic, and even more important, information. It is a long way from Frankfurt to Krakow. How much information was there in the area of the persecutions about life in the Ukraine? And the answer is almost none. They had no idea what was going on here, if there were opportunities or not, why it was far away, and there was very little connection. Now, if you look on a map of Germany, and you consider the fact that there were persecutions of the Jews, which there were, about which area was there information, and which would have been quite attractive. England at that time is not a very good option. What is the best option? It's not on these maps, it's on the map in your head.
Century?
What would be the nearest country to Germany? Switzerland then, of course, was very non-developed, so that would be very difficult. But the best is, if you go to a restaurant, what kind of restaurants do you have from Western Europe that are tasty? There are two. French restaurants, Italian. That's where you go. French or Italian, that's the way to eat. France would be fine, except there were persecutions in France. So even though the food is good, there's a problem. Where were there relatively few persecutions? In Italy. So therefore, it would seem logical that Jews who did try to flee persecution would go south. The weather is good, the food is good. Did this happen? And the answer is, where do we find the first Yiddish books? They're printed not in Germany, but in northern Italy.
Napoli?
Napoli is a bit to the south, more to the north. Yeah, and the food, plus you're in Italy. So that there is no question that some Jews from the German lands fled to Italy. How many, in what way, we don't have very many details. People who run away do not, fill out forms in the Middle Ages. But there was an alternative to Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, closer at hand, and that's apparently where the refugees went to. So that it does not seem likely that the Jews would come to the east from the German lands, from the heartland of Germany today. But we did find Jews, so they must have come from somewhere, and they did not come from the sky. What other option is there? Now here, we have to look at silent evidence, not the evidence of memoirs, because we do not have memoirs, but we have to look at the behavior of people. Now here, if we look at the earliest Jewish settlements in Eastern, that we know about, in Eastern Europe, not cases of individuals, but towns, where do they tend to be? The first to be tend to be farthest to the west. So that one finds in western Poland, what is now was called Silesia, one finds settlements, places like Wrocław, which is nearby, Poznan. These are the first big communities that we know about. Then which community grows? Kraków. Then the next big community to grow is Lviv. So this would suggest that the migration is coming from the west to the east. But who were these migrants? I would point out that this is evidence also against the Khazar thesis, because if it was the Khazars who came, we would expect the first settlements furthest in the east, and then afterwards in the west. But here, all the evidence we have is the first settlements are in the west, and only later in the east. So, what then can be the explanation of where the Jews came from? If they did not come from the Rhineland, from Germany, where did they come from? Now here, we have to consider one very simple but important factor of demography. And that is that when populations grow, they can grow very, very quickly, as long as there are good living conditions. You know the story about the king, it doesn't matter which king. It can be a king of Persia, a king of Africa, whoever you want, who had a servant who helped him very much. And he asked the servant, "How can I reward you? Whatever you want, I will give you." So the servant, who was much more intelligent than the king, because kings are usually not intelligent, but the servants sometimes are, the servant said, "Well, take a chessboard, a chess game, and we'll do something very simple. Put on the first square 1 piece of rice, and on the second square 2, and on the third 4, and then when you finish the chessboard, then that's all I want." And the king said, remember, kings are not intelligent. The king said, "Oh, come on, I want to give you a great deal. This is nothing." The servant said, "It's enough for me." Of course, if you calculate it, by the time you get to the last square, there is not enough rice in the world to put on the last square. Because if you begin with little numbers, they can grow. If you think about, here, I will give you homework, a task to do. I want everybody to go on an airplane and go to Montreal. It's a wonderful city to visit. Good food, good music. This is homework that you will not complain. The only problem is I cannot give you tickets. But if you go to Montreal, you will notice something interesting, that even though in most of Canada the language that is spoken is English, in Quebec the language that's spoken is French. And there are about 5 million speakers of French in Quebec. How did they get there? In the 18th century, they came over on boats from France to Canada. The boats were small. They didn't have big boats like today. And if the boats were small, the number of people who came was limited. It was maybe 5,000 speakers of French, no more. And there were no Khazars in Canada. They came over, but the land was healthy, there were no diseases, there was a lot of food, there was a great deal of land, and from a few thousand people, in about 300 years, there are 5 million, 6 million speakers of French in Quebec. If you look at South Africa, among the white population, most of the white population speaks Afrikaans, which is Dutch. How many people came from Holland to Africa? Even fewer. But again, good living conditions, many children, every child finds a place to work, populations grow very quickly. So that if we need to know where the Jews of Eastern Europe came from, we do not need to know about very many Jews. And a few Jews is enough to explain where the population came from. Tomorrow, we will try to understand where did these few Jews come from. The explanation will be information. That's enough for today. See some of you, whoever has stamina, see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.